Due Process, recipient of 5 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards since 1997.
Today I'm here to ask this court to spare Robert Morton's life.
Still another appeal of still another death sentence. It's been 17 years since the death penalty was reinstated here, yet there's been no execution. Justice served or justice stalled on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Its supporters say it's an instrument of justice. Opponents call it a national disgrace. I'm Raymond Brown, and we're talking about the death penalty. Does it serve as a deterrent? Is it evenly applied? Barry Scheck will be here with some hair-raising stories of innocent men who've been sent to death row, but his plea to do away with the death penalty will get plenty of resistance from Judge David Schroth, the former Mercer County Superior Court judge who earned the nickname Maximum Dave. They'll go head-to-head on this edition of Due Process, but first, here's Sandy King with a capital punishment update. Sandy?
Raymond, the state Supreme Court has made some decisions. The U.S. Supreme Court has done the same, but neither has changed the bottom line. Capital punishment is still the law in 40 of our 50 states. But here in New Jersey, that doesn't mean there's been an execution. There are 15 men on the state's death row. Some have been there for 17 years, in what some insist is a living death.
In a sense, it's torturing. You know, it's to be told that you're going to die. It's always there, constantly in your mind.
Lawrence Hayes knows firsthand what it's like to be warehoused until the state exacts the ultimate penalty.
You realize, especially if you have any education or some sense of political awareness, that you are dealing with the most powerfulest country in the world, and they have decreed that you will die. So that is always in your mind.
Although these days the former Black Panther is more likely to be found in institutions like this one, he spent 2.5 years on New York's death row for a cop killing he still insists he didn't do. But the Times turned out to be on his side. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court said stop to executions.
The criminal justice system does our society a disservice when it does exactly what it says should not be done, and that is to kill.
So his death sentence was lifted, and after 20 years of a life term, Hayes was finally paroled. But by 1976, the states were permitted to put the death penalty back on the books. And since then, 40 states, including New Jersey, have said yes to the possibility of official execution.
Here is the phone that the executioner would get the message from the administrator of the facility.
We're the only Western developed nation that currently has the death penalty. And we pollsters tell us that more than 2/3 of the adults in this country support the continuation of capital punishment.
Eventually, you throw up your hands and you say, what else can we do?
Of course, having capital punishment does not necessarily mean using capital punishment, although there are about 20,000 murders each year.
The number of death sentences is surprisingly small. Think about it. We have had some 600 death sentences since 1976, when death penalty statutes were permitted back on the books. Okay, that's 24 years.
And in New Jersey, where the death sentence made its comeback in 1982, 18 years later, there have been no executions.
That's evidence that the death penalty is working the way it should work in New Jersey, because we're being darn careful about what we're doing.
And so there is a long, complex system of appeals, including hearings before the state Supreme Court, like this one for Ambrose Harris, sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a Pennsylvania artist, to determine the proportionality of the sentence.
I'm here today because the public defender believes the system of capital punishment unconstitutionally places a greater value on a white life than a black life in a number of ways.
While she's arguing that the system itself is race-affected, I'm arguing that the facts and circumstances of the trial in this case was race-affected.
When you compare his case to other defendants who are similar to him, in no way can it be said that this death sentence is an aberration.
And neither side was mentioning the fact that Harris now is also charged with last year's death row murder of Robert Mudman Simon, because this hearing was only about the original murder and whether the sentence
was disproportionate in the sense of his having been singled out unfairly for capital punishment.
But a 1998 report from the Governor's Study Commission said proportionality review is one of the steps that should be cut from the process.
The feeling was that this was a statistical process, a very complex system of review that ultimately didn't really tell us anything reliable about how death sentences work in New Jersey.
I think it's uniquely important in New Jersey, where we don't have any other safeguards against that sort of disproportionality.
And so far, none of the panel's recommendations has been enacted. But the debate over whether there should be a death penalty for anyone goes on.
Racial and economic discrimination characterizes the imposition of the death penalty, so that instituting it as a policy has meant, and is likely to continue to mean, that poor people and black people, especially blacks who kill whites, are far more likely to end up on death row than well-off people and white people and killers of blacks.
How I see myself is an advocate for victims' rights, and I want to stress that as much as I possibly can, because inevitably when I appear on a panel like this, I never hear anything about the victims. And that's where I reach my moral dilemma.
In Illinois, 13 innocent people have been released from death row in the last decade after erroneous convictions were overturned. Fortunately, that's many more people than have been executed in Illinois during that time period.
It's my honor and my privilege to be here. Of course, over 30 years ago, had the state had its way, I would not be here to speak to you today. When the government stands before you and argues for revenge, argues for a base human reaction, something is wrong.
And though Lawrence Hayes insists that he was innocent, no court ever found him not guilty. But in Illinois, the governor's declared a moratorium on executions. That after more than a dozen death sentences were shown to be seriously flawed. Innocent men had been sentenced to death. And the Illinois scandal has led to the call for a national moratorium. Still, Raymond, the polls show that most people in this country favor capital punishment.
Sandy, as you know, most of those life and death errors were not uncovered by the justice system, but by professors and students at Northwestern University's Center for Wrongful Conviction, a program not unlike Barry Scheck's Innocent Project at Cardozo School of Law in New York. Barry's argument against executions and an answer from a judge who's presided over death cases when we come back, so stay with us.
Society as a whole that is the surrogate for the victim, and society then must take on the responsibility of exacting punishment, and that society loses something if it tries to punish an offender in a way which will equal the crime that was committed by the offender. So we don't take an eye for an eye, and we don't take the hands of a thief. We don't torture torturers or assault assaulters.
Justice Handler was part of a court that critics claimed was determined to prevent any executions despite the demonstrated wishes of the legislature. And though the makeup of the court has changed, there's still been no execution. But capital punishment remains the law here in New Jersey. Retired Superior Court Judge David Schroth thinks that is as it should be. But Barry Scheck, with Peter Neufeld and Jim Dwyer, has written a book that cites case after case of innocent people sent to jail and even death row. Barry, that leads me to want to start with you and say, look, I've heard people say, look, Barry Scheck's examples of people saved from death row is heartening because it means that the system works and is responsive to the claims even after conviction of those who are not guilty. Therefore, capital punishment is supported by the book.
I really wouldn't think so. Our book, Actual Innocence, goes through what are now 72 post-conviction DNA exonerations, 66 in the U.S., 6 in Canada. 8 of those individuals were on death row, including some of those Chicago cases you mentioned before that we worked with those people at Northwestern on. And the fact is that lots of thoughtful conservatives have responded to our book in a very positive way, and the reforms that we put out there to prevent the conviction of the innocent, but also, when you prevent the conviction of the innocent, you also have a leg up on catching the guilty individual before he or she commits more crimes. Now, George Will had a very favorable response to our book and said,
the conservative columnist.
Yes, and he said conservatives, after reading about mistaken identifications, jailhouse snitches, false confessions, junk forensic science, fraudulent forensic science, bad lawyers, quickest way to convict an innocent person, a bad lawyer, and there are plenty of underfunded bad lawyers out there, prosecutorial and police misconduct. He said, conservatives look at the criminal justice system as just another government program. So, putting aside the very considerable moral questions about the death penalty, what DNA exonerations are showing us, because we can go back and look at cases nobody's seen, 10, 20, 30 years, and just get evidence that nobody argues with, that these people are innocent. What it is showing us is that there are a lot more problems in the system than we thought, that the position of the American Bar Association, which has for the last 4 years been on record that we should have a moratorium on the death penalty because of the problem of bad lawyers, of unequal application, and the problem of the conviction of the innocent, must be taken seriously. Let's face it, in this country, 87 people have been taken off death row with proof after being put there of innocence that led to their freedom. For every 7 people executed in this country, there is 1 person taken off death row on the grounds of new evidence of innocence. Illinois is not different than Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, any of these other states.
Let me see if you've persuaded a guy who's known as Maximum Dave after we ask him why, Judge, they called you Maximum Dave.
Very quickly, they called me Maximum Dave because the very first 3 trials I had were first-degree armed robbery trials, and each of the defendants were convicted. So I imposed maximum sentences on each because they all had very bad criminal records. And that would be 20 years, 10 no parole, plus an ancillary charge of 10 and 5, so it would be 30 years and 15 no parole. Sitting in the front row that day was a reporter who's an ex-Green Beret who works for the Trenton Times.
And he said,
there was foam coming out of his mouth, and he loved my 3 sentences. And the next day, the paper was Schroth the max.
Okay, now given
ever since.
Well, given the fact that you are Maximum Dave, is anything that Barry said about the uncovering of innocent people on death row give you pause in your support for the death penalty?
No, it does not. It doesn't affect me at all. I cannot go back 10, 20, 30 years and tell you what you mean by they were treated unjustly or unfairly. I can deal with the present because I'm here now. I wasn't here all the time. But as far as the present is concerned, I think the state of New Jersey does not make any mistakes at all. We have never had a person on death row who has come anywhere close to being not guilty. And we don't have anybody who's come anywhere close to not being rightfully charged with death. In addition, I can speak, I think, for the state of New York, where Barry is from, and for the state of Pennsylvania, and I think they have excellent, safe systems with every precaution which protect the rights of all the defendants, and injustices are not done.
Barry, the judge,
I can't speak for Illinois.
Okay, the judge raised an interesting point. That is, there are even, I think, the strongest death penalty opponents, when you get past the moral question, say there are some states that are more rigorous in providing effective counsel, for example, than others. Do you think that's a distinction that makes any difference, or do you think all states can be fairly criticized as having systems where errors are too likely to occur to trust the death penalty?
Well, we all want to have the best systems possible, and I don't think there's any state that has achieved it. But what's striking about these DNA exonerations is that they're all cases, and there are some in the state of New Jersey, not death penalty cases yet, but other cases where people have been convicted. The appellate courts have affirmed those convictions based on confessions or even, most frequently, mistaken eyewitnesses. And then we have biological evidence that we could never test before. The tests are done, and everybody realizes, my God, this person is stone cold innocent, and nobody disputes it. And it's happening in case after case. The state of New Jersey, unlike New York and Illinois, does not have a statute which would permit somebody who is in jail, who could prove innocence with a DNA test, to have an opportunity to get that test, and if the individual can't afford it, to have that provided. That's why Senator Leahy, Congressman Delahunt, and Republican sponsors in the House and Senate have proposed what's known as the Innocence Protection Act, which would give this right to every inmate in every state. Now, 92% of the American people support this. Even death penalty proponents should support it, because it's just foolish to believe when you look at the examples in case after case. Just because the appellate courts have affirmed it, it doesn't mean a mistake wasn't made. DNA is showing that in case after case. So we can go back, Judge, 20 or 30 years and get an answer.
Why doesn't the hard science, I mean, if Barry can show you cases, which he clearly has, around the country where hard science proves almost beyond question that innocent people have been on death row, that the system of justice we have, even if it's better than some others elsewhere, is capable of making mistakes that can lead to execution of innocence?
I think people make mistakes in all fields of life, and it can happen in the judicial field also. But as I said before, I can't speak for the United States of America. I'm speaking for New Jersey. And New Jersey, I think, has a foolproof system. And if a defendant needs anything, he's going to get it.
Well, convictions are reversed in our system, so that would suggest that it isn't foolproof at the trial level.
But there is no Judge, would you support the legislation to give a DNA test that wasn't available at the time of trial to any inmate if it could prove that they were wrongly convicted or sentenced? You don't have that now in the state of New Jersey.
Well, I would support it. But my experience with the death penalty, and I have presided over 7 trials, and I defended an individual on death in 1966 when I was beginning as a lawyer. My experience is that they get totally fair trials. And when they're convicted, there's no doubt about their guilt. And if they receive the death penalty, there's no doubt that they deserve it.
Judge, I've been in a very peculiar position now, because I've looked at just alone 39 cases and researched the other 72. And there are many times that we've called up prosecutors, judges, and even, I'm sad to say, in some instances, many instances, the defense lawyers, and we say, wow, here's the evidence. Remember so-and-so, the eyewitness was so sure, everybody thought it was a fair trial, a mistake was made. Kirk Bloodsworth in Maryland was convicted of killing a little girl and sentenced to death. There were 5 eyewitnesses. I mean, there were reasons that we now know that there were mistakes made, but that happens. I guess, one of the things that you said in the setup that should be noted in terms of public support for the death penalty is that there's a 15% drop in light of these post-conviction exonerations lately. But more to the point, when you do public
15% drop in
support for the death penalty for the first time in the last 15 or 20 years, but when you ask the question to the American people, do you favor the death penalty versus a system of real life without parole? Real life without parole, the death penalty only prevails 51-49. And I think that, as Dr. King said, You know, how long? Not long, because the arm in the moral universe bends towards justice.
Now
I do think this is going to change.
All right, that speaks to the legislative process, where at least there's more debate, and in the executive branch, Frank Askin, a good friend of ours and a professor at Rutgers of constitutional law, is standing by in Newark. And Frank, I wanted to ask you whether you look at our state Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court, whether you see any sign or indication that those courts might be having second thought about the death penalty, either in light of the work on innocence that's being done or in light of other kinds of issues being raised?
Well, in some ways, both courts are going in opposite directions. For the first time in recent months, the United States Supreme Court majority is indicating it is getting concerned by all the revelations about innocent people on death row, and is beginning to take a much more careful look at capital cases than they have in some time. Even defying what seems to be congressional mandates to speed up the execution process. On the other hand, I think in New Jersey, after many years of procrastination and skepticism, we have a clear majority of our Supreme Court which has decided it can live with the death penalty. I think within 2 to 3 years there will be an execution in New Jersey.
Franklin, let me ask you one other question. This issue of proportionality review, of determining whether the race, for example, of victims or defendants plays a role, is that likely to make a difference in our state, do you think?
Well, it'll make a little difference, but I think the court has now backed down a little bit on proportionality over the objections, first of Justice Handler, and I think now over Justice Long. Justice Long took the Handler seat, but she seems to be continuing the Handler tradition of really vehement opposition to death penalty, recognizing that it is really inherently arbitrary and capricious. But the majority of the court, I think, has now decided they can live with the death penalty. Proportionality may make a difference in some race cases if the court is convinced it's being used arbitrarily and that many more non-white defendants are being sentenced than white defendants. But on the issue of proportionality itself, as to being disproportionate, I think the court has watered down the formula enough that they're going to let some executions go ahead.
Judge, let me come back to you, because you are known as a tough judge, but not one who was unfair, though I didn't always agree with you. But my question is, I think it's hard not to feel that the death penalty is affected by race and class of victim and defendant, or at least that's probably the most, to me, powerful argument or question that's raised. Do you ever have a sense that that's a valid concern about how the death penalty is used and therefore whether or not we ought to have it?
First of all, I would like to say I was always known as being totally fair by all sides, public defenders, defense accounts, prosecutors, witnesses, everyone. And the only time I was the max was when the person deserved the max, not the little guy. Now, to answer your question, I don't think race has anything to do with it. I think if a person commits a crime, whether they're white, black, yellow, red, whatever, they're charged, they're tried, they're either acquitted or they're convicted, and the process continues. And I don't know what race has to do with it.
So you feel
it's never been a factor in any trial I ever tried, and I presided over 500 jury trials, and it's never been a factor. And
Now, Barry, you don't claim that your book is, or the cases you've looked at are a balanced cross-section, but much of the argument about the death penalty has been in terms of race and class, both victims and defendants.
Well, there's, I think that while I'm certain the judge never acted on any kind of a racial animus, then you have to worry about, the jury in a particular case, or just, it infects the whole system, race and class. I don't think we can get around it. But one of the very strange and troubling findings in actual innocence is that when we look at the 66 post-conviction DNA exonerations in the United States, we find a very disturbing statistic. It turns out in this country that white men tend to be the perpetrators when white women are sexually assaulted. And when black women are sexually assaulted or murdered, or rape murder, black men tend to be the perpetrators. Only 10.7% of the sexual assaults reported in the United States involve a black man accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. Yet, when you look at the wrongful convictions with the post-conviction DNA exonerations that nobody's arguing with, what you find is over half involve accusations or convictions of black men for raping or rape murder of white women. Okay. That's a pretty scary number.
Quickly, a yes or no. I hate to do this, but 10 years from now, fewer than 40 states with the death penalty, given where we're going now?
No question. Within months, many states will have moratoriums. State of New Hampshire just voted to abolish it, although the governor vetoed it.
Judge, yes or no? Fewer states in 10 years with the death penalty? Frank, asking fewer states in 10 years?
Probably. I should like to note that there's
Got to go, Frank, but tell me, yes, fewer states?
I think,
okay.
Yeah.
We're going to have to come back and find out, because that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we'll be back here next week with another pressing point of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
What do I think of the death penalty? I think it's good. I think if you take someone's life, an eye for an eye. I believe in it.
How are you going to take a life for taking a life? It's, you know, double standard to me.
Well, I think the death penalty is necessary in some cases. However, I guess I'm a true believer in rehabilitation.
Executions have been overturned because they found with DNA evidence that the person was found innocent.
Yeah, I worked in a prison for 12 years, and I've seen people who were in for murder and had been completely rehabilitated, and others that never will be.
What do I think about the death penalty? I guess I'm for it in the right instance, the right case.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,